thanks again for everyone who is appearing. Just two brief housekeeping issues. Of course, as you know, there is an opportunity for rebuttal submissions to be filed by March 4th. We'll provide information at the end of today's testimony. And second, I'd like to again recognize the efforts of my colleague Steve Mitchell, who is helping us keep time, and appreciate all of your efforts in keeping us moving on that front, so we can have a full opportunity for everyone to provide testimony. I'd also like to recognize my colleague Mary Kritharis, Deputy Director over at the PTO's Office of Policy and International Affairs, and so she's joining us for the afternoon. So with that, let me invite the Internet Association to come up to the front. A warm welcome, and if you could introduce yourself and begin your testimony. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Ellen Schrantz, and I currently serve as the Director of Government Affairs and Counsel at the Internet Association. The Internet Association is the unified voice of the Internet economy, representing the interests of leading Internet companies and their global community of users. Paramount to Internet companies' continued ability to operate and compete in global markets is balanced copyright law, including protection of the robust limitations and exceptions that have allowed U.S. Internet companies to flourish. In our submitted comments and in today's testimony, the Internet Association specifically requests: first, that USTR's annual report includes substantive discussion of and attention to the limitations and exceptions central to the adequate and effective protection of IPR. Second, that USTR immediately issue warnings to states that have enacted or are considering enacting ancillary copyright laws. Third, that USTR ensure that distant intermediaries, such as Internet domain name registrars, are not reassigned IP enforcement responsibilities, which would have detrimental consequences for management of the Internet ecosystem. Limitations and exceptions are at the heart of the balance in copyright law to fulfill the constitutional purpose of promoting the useful arts. These robust provisions have a rich history in U.S. law and have been vital in ushering in the digital age. Cloud services, search engines, social media sites, blogs, video and music sharing platforms, and many more innovative online services rely on limitations and exceptions such as fair use and intermediary liability protections to allow the public access to legal content and create new forms of follow-on creative works. Internet platforms, in turn, are a global driver of the innovation economy, with Internet industries representing an estimated 6% of U.S. GDP in 2014, totaling nearly $967 billion. The United States has repeatedly emphasized the critical nature of exceptions and limitations, including in trade agreements dating back to 2004, and most recently in the IP chapter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Broadly, USTR's report should reflect this long-standing and successful policy of balance by including in its report efforts around the world to support fair use and other limitations and exceptions. Specifically, USTR's annual report frequently discusses recent legislative initiatives in countries that would impact U.S. stakeholders' access to markets through intellectual property laws. In its assessments, we urge USTR to commend countries that are making strides to balance intermediary liability and copyright laws, and to carefully advise nations examining new enforcement regimes of the critical role that limitations and exceptions play in fostering innovative environments that would open markets to U.S. companies. The Internet Association has provided country-specific suggestions in our written comments. One instance where U.S. companies are under threat in terms of market access is in states that have enacted so-called ancillary copyright laws. These laws act as a tax on quotations or snippets and directly contravene established international obligations under the TRIPS agreement, which clearly states that quotations from works lawfully available to the public shall remain free of such a levy. Unfortunately, Germany and Spain have already enacted ancillary copyright laws, which have proven detrimental for U.S. companies seeking legal clarity and certainty for operations in those states. These levies on snippets deny equal protection under IP law to U.S. companies whose business models include aggregation of quotations protected by international copyright standards. Despite the consequences of the German and Spanish laws, the European Commission is continuing to consider more widespread attempts at enacting ancillary copyright throughout the European Union based upon recent copyright communications. The Internet Association requests that USTR immediately include countries with anti-competitive ancillary copyright laws on its list, and that special attention be given to this issue to deter our trade partners from similarly harmful action. Effective protection of intellectual property rights should be the responsibility of the appropriate authorities only, and forum shopping should be discouraged. In particular, the Internet Association is concerned about any efforts or suggestions that domain name registrars should be liable for online content, which reflects an inaccurate understanding of the role of registrar accreditation agreements and sets a dangerous precedent of reassigning enforcement roles to intermediaries unequipped to monitor content online. For over 20 years, U.S. federal policy has carefully monitored the role of intermediaries in management of content, ensuring that the Internet is not policed by those who lack the expertise and enforcement tools needed to identify and combat infringement. In the case of DNRs, the contractual agreement under ICANN does not require monitoring or takedown of domains, and compliance with the requirement to take appropriate action is best left to the global multi-stakeholder model. Therefore, we respectfully urge USTR to refrain from the listing of domains or further suggesting that distant intermediaries be assigned a policing role not imposed by U.S. or international law. As internet companies continue to drive the global economy, we urge you to consider to ensure that our trade partners worldwide are well informed on the balance necessary in copyright law to cultivate markets that allow U.S. companies to compete and thrive. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thanks very much. Your first question will come from the U.S. Copyright Office.
Thank you. Your testimony, like that of CCIA, mentioned concerns with the ancillary copyright issue in both Germany and Spain. Your testimony recommends that they be placed on a list, but it does not specify which list. Do you have a specific recommendation for those two countries for us today?
I believe in our filings that we recommended the watch list. I'd be more than happy to double check our filing.
Great. Do you also want to handle the second question as well?
Sure. To follow on the discussion about the domain name registers, Internet Association asked, quote, that USTR refrain from listing of domains or further suggesting that distant intermediaries be assigned a policing role not imposed by U.S. or international law. And we note that there are other stakeholders that have differing views. Could you explain your position in more detail? And in a follow-up, what do you believe ICANN, WIPO, or the U.S. canon should do about these related issues?
Sure, thank you for that question. To clarify our position is simply that the Special 301 process should not be leveraged in an inappropriate way to address an issue that we believe is outside the scope. So the Registrar Accreditation Agreement is a private contractual agreement with ICANN. The United States historically has supported a robust multi-stakeholder model. And going to the second part of your question, we do support efforts to cooperate and inform the best ways to combat infringement. And in my written submission, we do outline, I believe, the Healthy Domain Initiative as one such way that multi-stakeholder model is looking at new ways to cooperate and work together. And so our position is that the 301 process is not the appropriate place to leverage or suggest that distant intermediaries have new responsibilities. The Registrar Accreditation Agreement is, I think, misunderstood oftentimes, and so our written submission details what is actually required by that and requests that we look to the global multi-stakeholder model for those solutions, examples of which are in our written submission.
Thanks very much. I think the final question's from USTR.
As a follow-up to the Copyright Office's question, and based on your response, do you think that Special 301 could be an appropriate mechanism for encouraging the type of cooperation that you support in ICANN and WIPO?
I think we would like to know exactly what cooperation would be pushed. We, in our written submission, I think clearly state that the global multi-stakeholder model when it comes to the registrar accreditation agreement is the appropriate place to look at those solutions. And so in terms of combating infringement, I will say broadly that, our companies have played a great role in combating infringement and looking at initiatives, private sector initiatives, and we support that process as it moves forward.
And since I also asked this question earlier to CCIA, I'll ask it to you now. What part of the Special 301 statute mandates or empowers us to consider the exceptions and limitations as part of the adequacy and effectiveness of IP protection and enforcement?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. It's an important one, and one that I'm glad we'll get to talk about twice here today so far. The statute provides two instances where USTR should look at countries. The first, where the interests of IPR rights are at stake. And I will say that, our industries, internet industries, rely on copyright law as much as traditional industries. The line between industries is blurring now more than ever. Our companies produce original content and have new and innovative platforms, unlike what we've seen ever before. And so when we talk about stakeholders in foreign markets examining copyright law for legal clarity, for the legal certainty necessary to operate there, our companies, internet companies, rely as much as, I think, traditional stakeholders on that. Secondly, the statute addresses market access issues. Ancillary copyright is a great example of where we've seen barriers to market access based on not having a complete perspective of those laws. In fact, one company, I think as my colleague at CCIA mentioned, withdrew from one of those countries. And although I can't give specifics here today, I can tell you that our companies do look every day at foreign markets and have failed to launch in certain foreign markets based on a lack of clarity and a lack of certainty in copyright regimes. And so I believe under both of those instances, as laid out in the Trade Act, our companies have a valued stake at hand that belongs in the Special 301 process.
Thanks very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
If I can now invite Knowledge Ecology International.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. A warm welcome, sir. Please introduce yourself and begin your testimony.
My name is James Love. I'm the director of Knowledge Ecology International. My first comment is that we have reviewed the submissions of Pharma, Bio, BSA, IIPA, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global IP Center, just to look at what puts a country on their list of targets. And I would say that certainly in Northern Africa, South America, and Asia, being big makes you a target. We're happy to provide a detailed statistical analysis of this in a follow-up submission. And I say that because just the size of your economy relative to other countries in your region basically puts you on the list, just to be clear about that. The BSA submission, I'd like to say that we agree with and appreciate the concerns of BSA regarding government involvement in the use of unlicensed software. So we're supportive of their complaints about that. We also understand and appreciate the BSA's concerns over government policies that discriminate against foreign suppliers of software. Here we note that the activities of the United States in spying on everyone, including anyone working for a foreign government, creates an environment where people around the world have legitimate concerns about backdoors and surveillance. BSA has also raised concern about rules that ban government use of cloud-based email programs and require data to remain within countries. And we also understand those concerns. However, again, the Snowden revelations of revelations of U.S. spying and the lack of effective regulation of consumer privacy contributes to these problems. So as long as the United States is seen as an aggressive actor in surveillance and is having weak protections on privacy, these problems will probably get worse. I think Tim Cook at Apple is trying to explain this to the FBI right now. We disagree with the BSA opposition to government mandates to make source code of software open, but again, we note that open software allows third parties to find surveillance backdoors and to address the need also for greater interoperability between programs and to ensure competition, particularly in the many markets where monopoly power exists. On the CCIA comments, we agree that ancillary copyright is a threat to both the U.S. internet companies and more generally a threat to the public, and it undermines access to knowledge. Governments have legitimate concerns over tax avoidance by companies, but taxing quotations and hypertext links is not the solution. We think this is a violation of the TRIPS and a barrier to trade, and we recommend placing the countries that do this on the priority watch list and consider an out-of-cycle review. As regard to the pharma, bio, and U.S. Chamber submissions, we note that pharma targeted 20 countries in the Special 301 this year. This included complaints about reimbursement policies in 18 countries, making pricing rather than IPR the most common complaint raised by pharma. In the United States in 2015, a Kaiser Family Foundation survey found that 72% of the public believes that drug costs are unreasonable. In another survey, nearly 7/8 of the country's top healthcare leaders found that favored government taking a bigger role in curbing the rising cost of prescription drugs, and 86% of CEOs responding to this survey supported giving the federal government the authority to negotiate drug prices on behalf of Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries. We note that both the Democratic candidates and Donald Trump for the GOP are campaigning to introduce tough curbs on high prices. I mention this because the perception of this proceeding in this room is it's a bad thing if people do things to bring prices down. But you walk outside of this room, and everybody's disgusted with the high prices of drugs. And you have hearings, you have speeches by thing, you have editorials, you have donors giving millions of dollars to people to work on this problem. You have the CFO for Home Depot complaining about the cost of drugs for Home Depot. You have companies involved in manufacturing processes complaining about this issue. And you have payers, private payers, insurance companies and governors that have to pay for drugs. So I think it's important to keep in mind that if you think your job is to keep drug prices high, you might have a conversation with the rest of America about that. We note that a lot of complaints by the companies have focused on India. India is important not only in its own right, because there's more than 1 billion people live in India, most of them poor, but because India is a go-to source for people that want to get generic drugs in other countries. There was a testimony in several, in a couple of the submissions that claim that there's an agreement that India has made not to issue compulsory licenses. If that agreement's with the United States government, given the fact that 80% of the world's population is essentially priced out of new prices for new cancer drugs and drugs for other severe illnesses, I think that that agreement should be made public, and I think we'd certainly like to see it. We're right now working on a compulsory license request in the United States on the prostate cancer drug Xtandi. It's a drug developed at UCLA and on Army and NIH grants. It's priced at $129,000 a year in the United States, and I think roughly a third of that in Japan, where the company that acquired the rights from UCLA is from. There's no country is remotely close to the U.S. price on that. As part of our application, I think we anticipate that we may have to, at least in the short term, source drugs, generic versions from India if we prevail on that effort. I know that we're right now involved in a separate effort in Scotland where a cancer drug for HER2-positive breast cancer patients is not reimbursed in that country. Not really a third world country, but it's just too expensive there. And again, it will be, if the U.S. is leaning all over India as a supplier, that will make that effort more difficult. We point out that the United Nations is just concluded as of Sunday, the day before yesterday, a request for submissions from people to deal with the issue of access to medicine problems and how to reconcile the policy coherence between human rights and and access to medicine and innovation, I would recommend that you look at it. I think there's like an unbelievably large number of submissions. Several people testifying after me have been participating in these as well. One of the things that's has come up is some countries have looked at the issue of R&D mandates, including some U.S. groups that in the past of advising some of the political leaders in this country that they think about focusing on the mandate to fund R&D as a different issue than looking at driving the prices up. I would just encourage that. I'd like to do some follow-up submissions on describing what some of the UN submissions do in the area of delinking R&D costs from drug prices and reconciling and increasing the policy coherence between human rights and objectives of innovation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Love. Your first question will come from the Department of Commerce.
Thank you. One of the concerns that was expressed earlier today by the Alliance for Fair Trade with India is that trade secrets are not adequately protected in India. And as the subcommittee analyzes the adequacy and effectiveness of India's trade secret laws, are there any principles or considerations you would suggest we keep in mind in doing that analysis?
Yes, I would hope that you didn't have an overly broad view of what constitutes a trade secret and that you didn't discourage governments from mandating transparency, including in some cases in terms of know-how when it's necessary. The United States faces very big problems and challenges in getting affordable copies of biologic drugs in the market. One of the barriers to that are the regulatory barriers related to the know-how, and a number of people are going to push for more mandates of manufacturing know-how in biologic drugs so that after the initial 15-year monopoly that they typically enjoy in the United States, you don't have like a 40-year monopoly on a biologic drug. We would like to sort of see the prices drop for biologic drugs in the same way they do for small molecules. And I think that the other thing is that there are concerns that some of the overly broad claims on trade secrets is used to withhold information about requiring disclosures on things like R&D cost and results from clinical trials.
Thanks. The next question comes from HHS.
Hi. I had a question specific to the issue of compulsory licensing, which is something that you have commented on in the past. Pharma has submitted a written comment this year that cites a study and a specific example of how compulsory licensing may not always be effective at achieving its intended purposes of lowering prices and enhancing access, which was Brazil's issuance of a compulsory license for an antiretroviral treatment in 2007, where it took the local manufacturer 2 years to launch production of a generic version. The question is just if you've had a chance to review that and if you have any response. Thanks.
Well, I can tell you right now, I'm involved in several compulsory license applications, and I don't think it's unusual to take a couple of years after you get the legal authority to do something to have a product on the market. You have to figure out how to make a product. You have to figure out how to make it bioequivalent. There's a lot of regulatory tests. If you look at the Hep C market, you had voluntary licenses from Gilead, including know-how. And Gilead did a great job with that in the countries that were involved in the licenses, but we're only now beginning to see the products enter the market. They didn't happen like within a few days. It took a while. So I think that the 2-year thing is I'm a little bit perplexed in that because you talk to anybody in the generics industry, things don't happen overnight. They may have had also, in the case of Brazil, they may have been moving up a learning curve in terms of some of their manufacturing capacity. But if pharma didn't think that the compulsory licensing reduced the price of drugs, I don't think they'd be complaining about it so much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Love. I'd like to invite the next group, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. Welcome, sir. Can you please introduce yourself and begin your testimony?
Thank you very much. I'm Chris Moore. I'm the Deputy Vice President for International with PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. On behalf of biopharmaceutical innovators in the United States and the more than 810,000 women and men they employ across the country. Pharma appreciates the opportunity to testify before the Special 301 Committee. Intellectual property, including patents and regulatory data protection, drives and sustains biopharmaceutical innovation. It enables access to today's medicines and promotes investment in tomorrow's treatments and cures. Where markets are open and intellectual property is protected and enforced, biopharmaceutical innovators have the predictability and certainty necessary to research, develop, and deliver new medicines for patients who need them. Innovation saves lives and helps reduce overall healthcare costs. New medicines have cut heart disease deaths by 30% and AIDS deaths by 85%. They account for more than 80% of increased life expectancy for cancer patients. There is much more to come. Pharma members are developing close to 400 new medicines for infectious diseases, including viral, bacterial, and fungal infections, smallpox, and drug-resistant malaria. Advances in genomics are propelling the discovery of new medicines. Derived from living proteins, biologics are revolutionizing the treatment of cancer, autoimmune disorders, and other chronic conditions. Pharma members are working to overcome systemic challenges that can prevent the poorest from accessing medicines. They are leading more than 340 initiatives with more than 600 partners towards sustainable solutions that improve health for all. But around the world, some of America's leading trading partners maintain or are considering laws, policies, and practices that deny or would deny adequate and effective intellectual property protection and fair and equitable market access. Pharma's submission highlights 6 top barriers and threats that are preventing biopharmaceutical innovators from securing patents, maintaining and effectively enforcing patents, and protecting regulatory test data. All require urgent action. For example, in Brazil, Thailand, and elsewhere, patent backlogs that can stretch as long as 10 years or more are delaying introduction of new medicines to patients and undermining incentives to invest in future treatments and cures. Backlog challenges are made worse by dual examination processes in countries like Brazil and Colombia. Restrictive patentability criteria in Argentina, India, and other countries are preventing innovators and generics alike from introducing new dosage forms and combinations that can promote adherence and lower overall healthcare costs. Among the most concerning examples of restrictive patentability criteria is Canada's Promise Doctrine, which imposes a heightened and unworkable patentability standard. It confounds the time-tested process by which innovators transform promising molecules into valuable new medicines. Based on the jurisprudence developed by Canadian courts, 24 patents on 20 innovative medicines have already been invalidated. Patents on many other products are at risk. Pharma members are seeing progress in Taiwan toward a mechanism that would provide for the early resolution of patent disputes, but weak patent enforcement remains a serious problem in China, India, Russia, and many other countries. Many U.S. trading partners, including Algeria, Turkey, and countries in Latin America, do not adequately protect regulatory test data. Regulatory data protection is particularly critical for biologic medicines, which may not be adequately protected by patents alone. High tariffs and approval delays deny fair and equitable market access for medicines invented, developed, and manufactured in the United States. A growing share of global trade in medicines now occurs outside the WTO Zero for Zero initiative. After additional duties and assessments are factored in, effective tariffs on medicines in India can be as high as 20%. Federal and state taxes in Brazil can add 38% to the price of medicines, the highest tax burden on medicines in the world. Because of lengthy regulatory delays, getting approval to make a new medicine available in China takes much longer than international practice. Patients are forced to wait for the treatments they need. These challenges are compounded by a growing array of localization barriers, from mandatory technology transfer requirements in Indonesia to discriminatory import barriers and procurement practices in Algeria and Russia. Pharma urges USTR to prioritize these countries and concerns in the 2016 Special 301 report and to use all available tools to address and resolve them. Meaningful out-of-cycle reviews are needed to assess progress and results in Canada, Ecuador, and India. We particularly encourage USTR and other federal agencies to address longstanding intellectual property and market access barriers in countries that are U.S. trade and investment agreement partners. These agreements require strong intellectual property frameworks and protect regulatory test data and enable inventors to resolve patent disputes prior to the marketing of potentially infringing products. However, many U.S. trade agreement partners fail to adequately comply with some or all of these obligations. Federal agencies should systematically review compliance and take steps necessary to ensure agreed rules are followed. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. We look forward to answering any questions and to working with you to address the serious concerns described in our submission for the 2016 Special 301 report. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our first question will come from Department of Health and Human Services.
Hi, thank you. I have a question with regard to your written comments on the need for transparency and due process in pricing and reimbursement policies. Keeping in mind that it's not possible or may not be possible for every country to adopt U.S.-style practices and notice and comment procedures, what do you think is the minimum level of transparency and due process that countries should be expected to provide, and does your expectation depend on the country's level of development? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. This is one of 3 challenges that we specifically highlighted with respect to market access, the others being the tariff and other import barriers, as well as the regulatory approval delays. When we look at the process for engaging in pricing reimbursement conversations with governments, there's some very basic provisions that are included in many U.S. trade agreements now that we think are very valuable as a basic level. And it's important for participants in regulatory processes to know what the rules are, to have some expectation that the rules will be stable over time, and that they will have a meaningful opportunity to engage in with the government as decisions are made, and with the government as decisions are made about any changes to the rules. So we think the types of procedures that are set out in our trade agreements provide that very basic level of concern about those issues and focusing on some of the most primary issues that need to be addressed.
For the second question, Department of Labor.
Hi. Your submission identifies restrictive patentability criteria in Canada and India as trade barriers. How much economic impact do these criteria, such as the patent utility standard in Canada or Section 3D in India, have on the U.S. pharmaceutical industry? And are pharmaceutical companies laying off employees in these markets or within the United States as a direct or indirect result of these patentability criteria practices?
Thanks very much. You've highlighted, I think, one of the principal concerns that we have outlined in our submission. If we're not able to secure patents as an industry, that's a really threshold challenge that really is a huge barrier to being able to innovate, but also to deliver medicines into new markets. The challenges with respect to Canada and the impact on the U.S. economy, I believe there was another submission that looked in particular at that issue. And with respect to the employment aspects, we certainly don't have it's always difficult to identify particular jobs that are related to particular challenges like this. But certainly it is having an impact on the United States, our ability to, the incentives that are there to enable us to continue to innovate, and the jobs that the industry supports, which we've mentioned in our submission.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your testimony today.
Thanks.
So if I could then invite the Program on Information Justice and Intellectual Property. Welcome, sir. Please introduce yourself and begin your testimony.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean Flynn. I'm the Associate Director of the Program on Information Justice and Intellectual Property, a research and academic program at American University. Let me start off by congratulating Christine Peterson for being the chair of the Special 301 Committee. This is the second chair and third year that this committee has been chaired by a WCL grad, and we expect that to continue indefinitely. And we will be happy to help you with that objective. So this has been a fabulously interesting hearing. I've been participating in this for a number of years, and I feel like when this process started, there were a series of academics and public interest organizations kind of advocating for more balance within the process. But this year, and perhaps last year as well, you see more U.S. industries, particularly technology industry, advocating for that same purpose. And I think that reflects a couple of different realities that I want to speak to. So my testimony, and I'll just refer to it broadly, but then I really want to get into some of the questions that I think the committee is dealing with, speaks about first the legal interpretation issues that I think have come up here a couple times, and I'll speak to that. But then second, the policy issues. So that, on the legal interpretation, I actually think that it's the way I frame the issue in the report, USTR itself has been changing the interpretation of what it is to be adequate and effective intellectual property. We see that in the result of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, a specific balance clause. But even going back before that, Matt Scherz referenced the long history of free trade agreements that have included ISP liability safeguards and other mandatory limitations and exceptions components within those agreements. Trade promotion authority language that requires the attention to intellectual property issues within free trade agreements has pretty much exactly the same language that governs 301. And although USTR and U.S. trade policy started only on the so-called protection side, it has evolved to represent a broader segment of American interests. And that is completely legally defensible. So this is an administrative agency that is the implementing agency for those statutes. It has a large degree of discretion in interpreting those statutes. And I think the overall thrust of those statutes, the intent, as was alluded to by IAPA, was to protect U.S. interests, exporting interests abroad. But the language in the statute itself is definitely broad enough to include limitations and exceptions issues. So if you look at 2242D2, defining the adequate and effective intellectual property standard, it refers to the mandate to protect companies and their rights relating to patents, rights relating to copyrights, etc. And so I would submit that in my opinion, similar to some of the technology companies, that fair use rights, that limitation exceptions rights, that rights to quote news of the day, etc. These mandatory limitations and exceptions found within copyright law, just like scope of patentability and other limitations within patent law. Did I say patent law first? Copyright law, fair use and copyright law. Scope within patent law are rights relating to intellectual property that affect the market access of those companies. So I think it flows from the language of the statute itself, and more importantly, it inflows from the way that U.S. policy has evolved lately to include limitations and exceptions issues within the scope of that interpretation. So just the rest of my submission is really coming out of some of our research agenda. So we've been focusing over the last year or so on developing an economic research program looking at the impact of specifically copyright limitations and exceptions, not just on U.S. businesses, but actually on the interests of other countries. So the question of, is fair use good for other countries? We're developing a very large survey to do a lot of econometric research, kind of pointing that out, but I've included as an appendix a very preliminary run of the data, which shows that both classic fair use industries, the CCIA member type people, but also traditional copyright-dependent industries benefit under fair use systems. So a number of countries outside of the U.S. have passed fair use, have emulated the U.S. model. And in those countries, we find that both the copyright-intensive and the technology industries seem to fare better. Those are not complete econometric studies of the kind that we hope to be able to present to this committee in the future. But the correlations show that fair use is not bad for the entertainment industry. It's not bad for the book production industry. In fact, as the scholarly literature would show, that all of those industries are as dependent on fair use systems as others. Now, the key with fair use and why it's so important, and why flexible limitations and exceptions, which the IAPA submission somewhat strangely castigates, are so important for U.S. businesses is because copyright laws change very infrequently. You know, many countries, it's been decades and decades since they changed their copyright laws, and they don't map well onto current modern technology. So, you know, until a few years ago, the Australia copyright law allowed reproduction only by a Xerox machine. It didn't allow digital reproductions. It was a 1960s era copyright law, and it was only applying to 1960s era technology. If you don't have an additional flexible limitation exception that is what we would call open and flexible, open meaning it can apply to purposes not specifically enumerated as fair use does, and flexible in that it turns on a balancing test that can be applied to those new situations. Without that, then Google is literally illegal in most of the world. You know, reproductions through digital technology would be literally illegal in most of the world. Specific goods which rely on intellectual property protection, like TiVos, like iPods, they would be illegal. So it's in the U.S. interest, but it's also in the interest of those other countries to have flexible copyright exceptions, not just for today's technology, but for future technology. And I think increasingly we hope to present to this committee the empirical proof that really proves that point. But I mean, I think we're getting to that point now, and I think U.S. trade policy already reflects it, as I've mentioned, in the way that, that trade is evolving. And that same policy should be reflected in Special 301, you know, most importantly because it's guided by exactly the same language that's guiding trade policy in general. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Flynn. Your first question comes from USTR.
Hello.
Hi.
So the Special 301 process is about identifying trading partners that fall short of the statutory criteria, and you've made your case for the statutory interpretation there. Your submission identifies deficiencies in limitations and exceptions in the copyright laws of more than 20 countries. Just so that we are clear, is it your position, is it PIJIP's position, that you're not making an affirmative recommendation to place any of those 20 countries on a priority watch list or watch list?
No. So I don't think PIJIP as an academic institution, first of all, falls into the statutory criteria of an entity that can really make a complaint and request for a listing. So we point out that information to take account into your deliberations as you go forward, and we do try to identify them specifically country by country. I would say, I mean, one point that I didn't mention, but we mentioned in the written material, there is the watch listing function, but there are other parts of the report that are incredibly discretionary. So the best practices areas of the report and the and I think there's one that's kind of the latest developments, the positive developments. I mean, both of those areas of the report traditionally deal with issues that are not technically within the four corners of the statute. And I would encourage that those areas of the report refer to positive developments on limitations and exceptions as well. We note specifically, for instance, Marrakesh Treaty implementation. It's an area that is in accord with U.S. policy that we hope will be featured as a positive development as we move steadily towards the number of countries that will be needed to actually implement that. And in addition, the consideration of more flexible limitations and exceptions regimes in countries that are either have already passed such regimes, like our trade partner Korea, or countries that are considering such regimes. And I would point out countries like South Africa, countries like Nigeria, countries like Hong Kong, other countries undergoing copyright reform. This is a key moment, a key process in which USTR can help reflect U.S. policy that copyright reform should include the kind of balancing language that was included in the TPP, for instance.
Great, thanks. One more question, I think, from our colleagues at Department of Justice.
Thank you very much. Let me just say, I think PGIP is doing some excellent work. These are very, very important issues, so we really appreciate your contribution.
This is on tape, right?
To the process. Just don't use me as a blurb for your book. Okay. But I do want to kind of press you a little bit on your distinction between open systems of limitations versus closed systems. You mentioned fair use as being an example of an open system. But as you know, a lot of the attempt to define the scope of limitations and exceptions in the U.S. Through our adversarial system, through litigation. Other countries, developing countries, don't really have the infrastructure and the institutions set in place to maybe define those rights outside the process, the formal statutory process. So do you think that the U.S. model can really be replicated that well in developing countries?
Yes, I do. So actually, it's a piece of our ongoing research. So I think what you've articulated is a very frequently enumerated myth, and the myth is that other countries outside of the U.S., except there are a few that have actually adopted fair use, don't have open and flexible copyright limitations and exceptions. And that's actually untrue. So if you break out fair use into its component parts, and I've talked about openness being the application to a larger number, an open list of purposes, and second, turning on a balancing clause. Actually, that's a fairly frequent attribute of copyright systems around the world, whether or not it's called fair use. So to take an example, South Africa's quotation right. South Africa's quotation right states that you can quote for any purpose as long as it's consistent with fair practice. Well, that is an extremely open and also flexible limitation and exception. It exists in a developing country, and there's actually very little litigation about it. But what's important about it is it provides that openness, a space for new entrants to come in and look at that copyright law and say, you know what? This quotation right isn't just for criticism and review. We can actually do Google News in this country because the quotation right is so broad. We can actually do Facebook postings in this country because the quotation right is so broad. It's countries where you don't have that openness and flexibility that I think, and I hope to report back soon, that we're going to find real problems, because companies do go and they look at copyright law, and if you have fair use, that's a clear kind of green flag that you can do innovation. But you can find those green flags in other portions of laws, and we do find them. And so I think that the actual prevalence of these systems around the world kind of disproves the idea that only the U.S. can do fair use. Actually, countries are doing similar things all around the world right now.
Great, thanks very much.
Thanks, Troy.
So if I can invite Public Citizen to come up, please.